Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think opposition forgets that this isn't just some random thing that you do to get out of prison. It is a major surgery that people undergo in order to get a shorter prison sentence. Before I go into my clashes and extensions, now let's just go into some things that they have said and some rebuttals. I think a major thing they have said is that basically this washes off the whole purpose of the justice system, and it basically erodes all point that the justice system even brings in the first place, right? I think, first of all, we think that it's a form of retribution. It's already been clarified by first speaker that this is inherently a form of retribution already. I think the fact that you basically donate a major organ of your body to another person, the fact that you have to go through a major surgery and have to sit through this major surgery, possibly suffering through complications and perhaps impeding your ability to live a normal life for the rest of your life, is a form of retribution. And that's what we tell you, right? And I think secondly, they tell you about how petty criminals basically get some benefit by staying in prison and basically getting the rehabilitation that comes with it. I think, first of all, this is a wash. Why exactly? Because if their sentence is already short, then I don't see why prisoners would necessarily want to opt into a major surgery, giving up a major organ in order to get out of perhaps 6 months of prison, right? So I think that just doesn't make sense in the first place. This applies to criminals who have way longer sentences, who have committed perhaps worse crimes, right? But I think lastly, on their point that it's coercive, right? I think the fact that prisoners are already locked up in jail, the fact that you take away their civil liberties by the time that they have been convicted of a crime is already taking away their right. It's already taking away their civil liberties, right? The fact that we still allow prisoners to opt into this, the fact that prisoners are still allowed to be and still required to be of perhaps minimum legal age and also within proper mental capacity to be able to donate their organs, also proves to use that you don't necessarily totally remove this element of choice and this element of the basically coercion or whatever. So I think now let's go into 3 clashes. First of all is about justice and retribution. Number 2 is about the value of having more organs and why we would actually value that over other things such as community service or parole. Number 3 is about the fact about coercion and the usefulness of prisoners in prison, the fact that they're not doing anything in status quo. I think, first of all, let's go into the major clash, which is basically the retribution and the whole point of the criminal justice system in the first place. I think because of the fact that this will essentially apply to a lot of people who are serving longer prison sentences, who basically have to almost life sentences or basically have sentences that are really long, which they would like to be cut short. I think obviously we can assume that they have committed a crime that was quite bad or really, really bad. I think now we need to recognize that for many of these major crimes, especially when we're talking about murder, right? I think essentially and fundamentally, there is nothing that you can do to basically bring back or completely justify or basically punish this act of murder, right? I think just because you either hang somebody or just because you actually lock them up in prison for the rest of your life doesn't actually bring the victim back, right? It doesn't bring the victim or it doesn't bring the families of the victims any sort of closure because their loved one is still gone at the end of the day, right? And obviously prison isn't a perfect solution to justice, right? But also we say that because it's not a perfect solution to justice, we would also concede that basically everything is not a perfect solution to justice because there's fundamentally nothing you can do to bring your loved one or your dead loved one back, right? So why do we think that it's a major form of justice? I think I already kind of addressed this, but basically you're putting them under a major surgery. You're basically forcing them to donate an organ, not essentially forcing, but essentially basically requiring them to donate an organ if they obviously want to get a lesser prison sentence. And obviously now you're harming their chances of basically living a normal life, right? I think another way which this basically serves the justice is especially for people who commit violent crimes, criminals who have committed violent crimes, especially murder or some sort of violent crime at the end of the day. I think number 1, the fact that they have to donate their organ is obviously going to impede them in some way physically, right? The fact that if I have a kidney removed, right, now I can probably live like a normal person, but I can't do the things that I used to do, right? Not even mentioning the fact that if a person donates their liver, if a person donates their lungs, then their physical capabilities will be even further impeded, right? Which we think is a form of retribution because now it's basically a signal to the victim that this crime was so bad that they had to get rid of an organ in order to get some sort of retribution, to get some sort of basically closure for this at the end of the day, right? So we think at the end of the day, we don't think that side opposition gets any more form of justice, especially for more serious crimes such as murder, nor do they solve the fact that basically the crime has already been committed, right? And also lastly, we already tell you that basically by opting into this and by criminals voluntarily choosing to basically donate their organs, they are basically voluntarily physically impeding themselves at the end of the day. That is the form of justice that we get on our side of the house. Now let's go into basically how it's basically the value of having more organs and why we would actually weigh that over everything that they have said, right? I think they've mentioned a couple things, which is that they, number one, maybe they'll legalize donating organs. I think first of all, it's already legalized. You can already donate organs. I think what they were trying to say is that you can like be able to sell your organs. The reason why this ability isn't legalized and the reason why we don't have people actively selling their organs is because obviously not many people, or at least people with the financial capabilities or the financial ability to not sell their organs, would not do it at the end of the day, right? Because obviously we recognize that there's a lot of risks going into this major surgery, basically donating an organ, right? There's already a lot of complications that people have in status quo with donating blood, with donating organs, right? So we don't necessarily see why basically this would be a good thing to basically allow people to get money for, because we think you disproportionately target people who are disenfranchised, who don't have the money or the financial capabilities to opt out of this, because it seems like a very lucrative decision, right? So if they're talking about coerciveness, we think that it's basically worse on their side of the house, right? Because now people who are poor are basically kind of incentivized and forced into this. That is a form of coercion, right? And also at the end of the day, when you are in prison and when you do have an active choice, when you do have basically a right to choose, we think that it is completely under their discretion whether they want to go into this major surgery or not. But we say that we will value the organs that are at the end of the day at the end of the day harvested by them, because obviously we have a big organ crisis, as was stated by our second speaker. A lot of people are on waiting lists. They can't get organs because there are not enough people donating. And the reason why people don't donate is because obviously if they don't get any financial like incentives or financial incentives for this at the end of the day, then they won't do it, because it's a major surgery and it's a huge risk to another person, right? I think lastly, we'll just talk about the usefulness of prisons themselves. I think now in status quo, I think prisoners are already kind of useless, right? And when you talk about justice, a lot of prisoners who have committed like bad crimes, they can get out for things such as parole. So obviously when you want to talk about things such as justice and retribution, we don't think that that currently exists in the justice system, because this form of parole exists, right? And obviously if I can get out basically in 5 or 6 years for something really bad that I did, we don't think that's a form of justice. But what we think is a form of justice is basically prisoners being able to be useful to society in some sort of way, right? Being able to donate their organs, being able to basically donate blood or whatever to basically help people who obviously need it the most, right? It's a form of them being able to give back, kind of a form of retribution for the crimes that they did. I think lastly, well, let's just talk about the fact that the usefulness of prisoners themselves is already like kind of on their side. It's already kind of in status quo. The fact that prisoners can do community work, the fact that prisoners can already basically opt into these programs is kind of telling of the things that we allow prisoners to do in order to give back to society. And with that, I've never been prouder to propose.